Count how many grandparents you have left. Now count how many of your ancestors, 500 generations back, ever got the chance to hold their own grandchild. For most of human history, the honest answer is almost none. You've probably heard the number that explains why. It shows up in documentaries, in textbooks, in the caption under some caveman meme. Hunter-gatherers, the claim goes, had a life expectancy of 30, 25 in some retellings, which means, if you believe it, your ancestors were basically finished by the age you are right now, old, worn out, done. Here's the problem. That number is one of the most misunderstood statistics in the history of science. And once you understand why it's wrong, you will never look at your own grandparents the same way again. For 99% of human history, there were no hospitals, no antibiotics, no clean water on tap, no ambulance, nothing standing between a bad fever and the end of your life. And yet the people who survived childhood in that world lived almost as long as you will. Stay with this, because the real reason humans ended up with long lives has almost nothing to do with modern medicine. It has everything to do with one specific family member nobody expected. Let's start with the number itself. Life expectancy at birth sounds like it's telling you how long a typical person lived. It isn't. It's an average, and averages get wrecked by outliers. Anthropologists Michael Gervin and Hillard Kaplan spent years compiling actual death records from hunter-gatherer and small-scale forager societies around the world, real recorded ages, not guesses. Their 2007 study reframed the entire field. Childhood mortality, dying before age 15, from infection, a difficult birth, a fall, an infected cut, was up to 100 times higher than it is in a modern country today. One statistic, all by itself, is enough to drag a population's average age down into the 20s and 30s. It has nothing to do with adults aging fast. It has everything to do with how many children never became adults at all. What actually killed people before 15 wasn't old age wearing them down early. It was infection with no antibiotic to stop it. A birth that went wrong with no one trained to intervene. A cut that turned septic. A parasite. A fever. A bad season with too little food for a small growing body to handle. None of that is a slow decline. It's a narrow, brutal filter that either lets a child through or it doesn't, and it has almost nothing to say about how long that child would have lived if they'd made it past it. So what happened to the ones who did make it? This is the part that should surprise you. Gervin and Kaplan found that once a person survived to age 15, their remaining life expectancy looked, in their words, very similar to a modern human. The single most common age of adult death, what demographers call the modal age, meaning the number that shows up more than any other, landed somewhere between 68 and 78 years old across dozens of pre-modern societies on different continents. Not 30, not 40, close to 70. Your ancestors weren't collapsing from old age in their 30s. They were either surviving childhood or they weren't. If they did, they got nearly the same shot at old age you have right now. But that's not the strange part, because surviving to old age and old age being common are two very different things. And for most of the human story, grandparents were rare not because 70 was unreachable, you just learned it wasn't, but because so few people cleared the childhood gauntlet in the first place. Anthropologists Rachel Kaspari and Sang-Hee Lee measured exactly how rare using teeth. Teeth wear down at a fairly predictable rate as you age, which means a fossilized jaw can tell you roughly how old its owner was when they died. Kaspari and Lee examined 768 individuals spanning 3 million years of human and pre-human evolution and calculated something they called the OY ratio, older adults to younger adults, a simple head count of how many people in a population lived long enough to become a grandparent for every young adult who died before they got the chance. Among Neanderthals, living between roughly 130,000 and 30,000 years ago, the ratio was bleak. For every 10 young adults who died, only about 4 made it past 30 into what would count as grandparent age. Then, in Upper Paleolithic Europe, starting around 30,000 years ago, that number didn't creep upward. It jumped. For every 10 young adults, 20 people now survived into old age. A 5-fold increase in evolutionary terms, almost overnight. Here's where it gets uncomfortable. That exact window, 30,000 years ago, is also when the art appears. Chauvet Caves paintings, roughly 36,000 years old, a sudden explosion of symbolic jewelry, long-distance trade, and far more sophisticated tools and weapons than anything that came before. For the first time in the human story, grandparents became common at almost the same moment human culture caught fire. Nobody has fully proven that one caused the other, but one researcher has spent decades building the case that it did. Which raises a question nobody likes the answer to. Why would evolution bother keeping people alive for decades after they stop having children? A body that can no longer reproduce shouldn't matter to natural selection at all. And yet here you are, descended from a species that kept its grandmothers around anyway. Anthropologist Kristen Hawkes spent years in the 1980s watching older women in the Hadza community of Tanzania forage not for easy food, but for deep-buried tubers that young children physically cannot dig up on their own. She noticed something specific. When a Hadza mother had another baby, her older children's growth and survival depended heavily on how much food their grandmother brought home that week. A grandmother who kept working fed the grandchildren. The new mother no longer had time to feed. That let mothers have their next child sooner, without their older kids going hungry in the gap. Hawkes calls this the grandmother hypothesis. And the logic is blunt. Women who stayed strong and capable well past their own fertile years left behind more surviving grandchildren than women who didn't. Run that pressure across enough generations, and you get exactly the kind of shift that rewrites a species' lifespan. It's also likely why humans are one of the only species on the planet with menopause at all. Most animals stay fertile until the day they die. So picture one of those evenings, 30,000 years ago, in the upper Paleolithic, after grandparents had finally become common instead of rare. A fire, a handful of families, smoke drifting up into a cold, clear sky. And now, reliably, for maybe the first time in the whole human story, someone in that circle has survived 70 winters. Her hands are slower than they used to be. Her eyes are worse. She isn't hunting anymore, but she is still there, night after night, in a way almost no one's grandmother had reliably been before her. Anthropologist Polly Wiesner studied what modern foraging groups actually talk about once night falls, and found something telling. Daytime conversation is full of complaints and gossip, but firelight conversation shifts almost entirely towards something else: stories, myths, who did what and what it meant, and what happened the last time the herds didn't come, or the river ran dry, or a stranger showed up hurt. A woman who remembers 70 winters isn't just an extra pair of hands around camp. She's a living archive nobody else in the group can be. Knowledge that used to die with the one person who learned it could now survive them by 40, 50 years tested, corrected, passed down, and passed down again. And that's when everything changed. Not human bodies, those had been capable of 70 years for a long time before this. Human information. A species that could finally keep its elders around long enough to teach the same lesson twice, or 3 times, is a species that stops relearning everything from scratch every single generation. That is the real answer to why humans ended up with such unusually long lives compared to every other ape on the planet. It wasn't medicine, and it wasn't luck. It was grandmothers, buying just enough extra survival time to let culture compound, instead of resetting to zero with every death. Which is the part that should land differently once you think about your own family. Somewhere in your line, an ancestor lived past 70 at a moment in history when that was still rare enough to reshape the group around her. She wasn't resting. She was working, feeding children who weren't hers to feed, telling stories nobody else in camp could tell, buying her family a head start that every generation after her quietly cashed in on, including yours, thousands of years later, without anyone alive today knowing her name. Every piece of advice your own grandparents ever gave you, how to cook something properly, how to get through a hard year, what not to trust, sits on top of a habit that is only 30,000 years old. Before that, a species could not reliably keep the people who knew things around long enough to pass those things on. So count your grandparents again, or the ones you remember, even if they're gone now. For most of human history, that number sat close to 0, not because your ancestors gave up at 30, but because so few of them ever got the chance to become one. The ones who did changed everything that came after them. You're not just descended from people who survived. You're descended from the ones who stuck around long enough to make sure everyone else did too.